The title is The Hebrew Marriage and Divorce. And the subtitle is In the Changes Jesus Brought or Implemented. The Changes Jesus Implemented. In ancient Israel, there were two different standards. One standard was for the priests, and another standard was for the common Israelite. The priests, for example, could not marry a divorcee. Anyone among the people of Israel could marry a divorcee, but not the priests, not the high priest. We read this in Leviticus 21, verse 7. Leviticus 21, verse 7. Both the common Israelite and the Kohen means the priests, were bound by the old covenant. And Leviticus 21:7 says, "They shall not take a wife that is a whore or profane, neither shall they take a woman put away from her husband." That's a divorcee. They could not marry a woman that was put away. They couldn't marry a woman that was profane, that was a whore. So if you're single, be aware that if you marry a woman that is of doubtful history, after being baptized, you cannot be ordained. And the scripture says, "For he is holy unto his God." Now let's take that idea for a moment, that the priest could not marry a divorcee. Peter tells us that all of us are priests in the new covenant. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 says, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." So we have the example in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 21, verse 7, and we're going to unite that with 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, that the priests could not marry a divorcee. Now, what was the Jewish wedding like? I was able to find in Jewish sources from the most important commentary in Judaism. It's a Sephardic commentary. It dates to the 1700s. It's called the Me'am Loez, where they detail exactly what we have been saying for a long time. But this was direct from a Jewish source. Me'am Loez. And it says in volume 18, "According to Torah law, the marriage ceremony involves a two-stage process." So the Jews, in order to perform a wedding, have to go through a two-stage process. In the first stage, it's called the Kiddushin. There's another word for it, and they mention it. I'll give you both. Kiddushin. Also called the Erusin. That's stage number 1 of the Jewish wedding. According to Torah law, the marriage ceremony involves a two-stage process. This is what the Me'am Loez says, volume 17, pages 36 and 37. In the first stage, Kiddushin, a man consecrates a woman as his wife. Notice the term they use, consecrate. They consider holy matrimony. From this time onward, she may not marry another man without a divorce. Nevertheless, the bride and the groom may not live together as man and wife. So, the families come together, the rabbi is there. Sometimes they have a bill called the Bill of Kiddushin. And the woman now is consecrated that she cannot have another man. But he can have another woman, according to Jewish law. But she cannot. In the Old Covenant, a man could be polygamous. Even a Levite could be polygamous. But not the woman. The Me'am Loez continues and says, Kiddushin is also called erusin, a term generally translated as betrothal. So now we're going to get into some words that appear in our Bible. You find the word betroth. Betroth. And we have the word espoused. We know this word espoused. That's where we get spouses. My spouse is my wife. Your wife, a spouse, is her husband. Espouse and betroth is stage one of the Jewish marriage. You are the husband, she is the wife. But you can't sleep together. She goes back to her home, you go back to your home. And you wait 1 year. It says here, in Torah law, okay, Kiddushin is also called Idusin, a term generally translated as betrothal. In Torah law, it implies the foregoing of the first stage of the marriage bond. In Talmudic times, the Kiddushin preceded Nisu'in by 1 year. So in this stage, you go 1 year. You are husband and wife. You cannot sleep together. You can't cohabitate. Cannot cohabitate. And she can't marry anybody else. Stage 2 is Nisu'in. That's what the Jews call it, the Nisu'in. Now the groom, in the first stage, was responsible as a new husband to create a bond of Kiddushin with his wife. This included by giving money or its equivalent to his intended wife. So you give a down payment here in the betrothal. You give some type of money, or the Me'am Lo'ez says by offering a bill of Kiddushin, just like a marriage bond is dissolved by the transfer of a bill of divorce, it can be forged by the transfer of a bill of Kiddushin. So you have bill, or you have an agreement, a contract. Here you have a contract. And you have money or something of value that is given. What did we call that money? Dowry. That's right, a dowry. So stage 1 in the marriage process, the Kiddushin or Edusin, is translated as betroth. Now in English, it's very fascinating to look at the etymology of this word betroth. You know what it means? It means be true. Be true to your husband. Be true. Now, in the Christian era, we know that collectively the church is the woman. We cannot have another husband. We are consecrated to Jesus. We need to be true to him. He says, I am the truth, the way, and the life. But we're still in the Hebrew dispensation here. So be true. The groom truly took his wife as his wife to be and promised to fulfill the second stage of marriage, and she promised she would have no other men. Betroth appears 12 times in the King James Version. And it's defined as a spouse or betroth, according to Strong. Now, Hosea has beautiful language about betroth. Go with me to Hosea chapter 2, verse 19 and 20. So, still in this betrothal. Hosea chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. As a matter of fact, the next wedding I do, if I remember, I'm going to use these verses. Hosea chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, it says, I will betroth thee unto me forever. So it's already setting the stage that marriage is forever. I will betroth you forever. Yea, I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness and in judgment and in loving kindness, and in mercies. I will even betroth thee unto me in faithfulness, that thou shalt know the Lord. Now this is very important, this last phrase. We are betrothed to get to know God better. No one should go to the marriage if you don't think you're going to make your possibilities of salvation better, and increasing your probability that you will be saved by the person you're going to marry. You should never come to the altar. You says, oh, it may work out. No. I remember the way James Dobson said. He says, a man must come to the point with his bride that I cannot live without you. I cannot live without you. Not to the point, it may work. I think it'll work. No, I can't live without you. This, be truthful. We need to be true. So, in these words, we want to state that number one, that this betrothal is a statement of a union forever, because it says forever. It's a union to maintain faithfulness to each other, to be faithful. It says, I will betroth thee unto me to faithfulness. She cannot be with anyone else. It is a union to get closer to the Lord, to know the Lord. It is a union to exercise mercy with each other. Mercy means to treat someone better than they deserve. That implies forgiveness. God is merciful because he forgives us. Husband and wife need to forgive each other. I will never forget the moment that Brother Ahukum, Humberto Ahukum, and his wife were standing up front in Cedartown, and Brother Pastor Ahukum said, I have never had a disagreement with my wife. And then he let this long pause. And all the men were thinking, he's not telling the truth. You know, we've been married. We know there's disagreements. And then he says that we have not been able to solve by the grace of God. Yes, that is a complete statement. We have never had a disagreement that we could never solve by the grace of God. This betrothal allowed the groom even to be released from going to war. We find that in the Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 7. Deuteronomy 20, verse 7. If you were betrothed, you didn't have to go to war. Deuteronomy 20, verse 7. They would call volunteers to go and fight. And then the leader would stand, the commander, and says, what man is there that hath betrothed the wife? Betrothed. So, Kiddushin, you have not yet gone to the second stage of living with your wife. You're only betrothed. You're in that first year. What man is there that hath betrothed the wife, and hath not taken her, has not completed Nisuin? Let him go and return unto his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man take her. All right, the second stage is the Nisuin. And I read from the Me'am Loez, same volume 18, page
17 or 18?
18, volume 18. Page 36 and 37. It says, the second stage of marriage knows life together. How does that happen? Jesus tells us about it. They usually at night, Jewish weddings take place at night. The groom is at his house. He's really the husband. He gathers the best man with him. And this great parade goes from his house all the way to the house of the father of his wife to receive her. And then they start to walk back. Then the virgins join that are friends of the wife. They join in the night, the procession. And they all walk together to the groom's house for a ceremony and for a meal. The second stage, the husband has to give his wife a ketubah. Ketubah. This is a marriage contract. And they have to cohabitate. So a complete marriage needs these two things. You need a marriage covenant that you sign, and you have witnesses, and you need to sleep together. Otherwise, it is not a complete marriage. Now, if you are in stage 1, Kiddushin, and you want to break this betrothal, this espousal, you need to write a letter of divorce, which is called the get. Letter of divorce. This is more binding than our engagement in the United States. You have to write the letter of divorce. Otherwise, she is still married to you. And even here in America, where there are so many Jews, we have more Jews living in the United States than in Israel. We have more Jews living in New York than in Israel. And they have a lot of problems, the Orthodox Jews, because an Orthodox Jew, the wife can go to court and get a divorce, but according to Orthodox Jews, she is not divorced until he gives the get. Only the man can give the get. So, in this betrothal, if they want to separate, the husband must give the wife a letter of divorcement. We go to the Bible. We're going to read from our classic text in Matthew chapter 1. Who has that? Matthew 1. Matthew chapter 1. Matthew 1, verse 18 through 20. Do you have it? I will read it. It says, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when as his mother Mary was espoused," there you go, betrothed, she was betrothed, "to Joseph, before they came together, before Nisuin, she was found with the child of the Holy Ghost. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily." He was going to write a letter of divorce, a get. This is called the get. In Hebrew. I'm going to give her a get. "But while he thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife." It's thy wife. She's a wife. She's only betrothed, but it's a wife. And he's the husband. "For that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost." Now we can understand the statement of Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. When Jesus says that a man can put away his wife because it's in the first stage of Kiddushin. Like with Joseph and with Mary. That's his wife. He is the husband. She is the wife. They have not slept together. They have not seen each other. They have a contract. A Kiddushin bill, maybe. They haven't given a ketubah yet. The husband gives that to the wife, the ketubah. Only the husband can give it. Now, there's one case in the Old Covenant where divorce was not permitted. So we already studied one case where you could not marry a divorcee, and that was the priest. Now we're going to look at a case where you could not divorce your wife, according to Hebrew law. We go to Deuteronomy chapter 22. Deuteronomy 22. Deuteronomy 22, verse 28 and 29. "If a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed," again, not with the Kiddushin, first step is betrothed, "and lay hold on her and lie with her, and they be found, Then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he hath humbled her, he may not put her away all of his days. So here you have a situation which we call fornication. Deuteronomy 22, verse 28 and 29. If a young man and a young woman slept together without being married, or if they slept together during the Kiddushin, but in this case it says they don't have a Kiddushin, they're not betrothed, and they sleep together, they're guilty of fornication. He has to pay the dowry, 50 shekels. The man pays the dowry, like we saw here, the money, the dowry. He pays it, and she becomes his wife, and he can never divorce her. Never divorce her, all his life. That was in the Old Covenant. We're going to see that when Jesus enters the stage, he starts to change things. The Me'am Loez says, it is likewise forbidden for a priest to marry a divorcee. It makes no difference whether she has actually married, she was actually married or divorced, or merely betrothed, as the arusa and divorce. So we covered that already, that it was not possible for a priest to marry a divorcee, and it wasn't possible for two people who were together in fornication. They had to marry, and they could never divorce. Now, there was a reason for divorce. We go to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, so they took a wife, Kiddushin, married her, Nisuin, both, taken her and married her. It came to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanliness in her. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement, a get, and send her out of his house. Now in Israel there were two schools. Can I erase this? Okay, take a picture. We'll erase it. There were two schools of thought. There were two schools that were both Pharisee houses. There was the Bet Hillel and the Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. These were two Pharisees that lived 100 years before Christ. And Hillel has continued till our day. You find in Jewish circles the name Hillel all the time. The Talmud says that Hillel was right and Shammai was wrong. Now Hillel said, Bet, the house of Hillel, said you could divorce a woman for any reason. If she burns your meal, you can divorce her. Any reason. But Bet Shammai said only for adultery. Or fornication. Only for that reason, you could divorce her. Now, what did Jesus say? Matthew chapter 5. We go to Matthew. Matthew chapter 5. Verse 20. Matthew 5:20. This is very important. Matthew 5:20. Jesus, these were two houses of Pharisees. The pious. Jesus says, "For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." We need to have a higher standard than Bet Shammai. The world takes this stand. Bet Hillel. The world. The Adventists take this stand. Theoretically. Because in practice they do everything. Theoretically. Only in the case of fornication it's okay to divide. But Jesus says your standard has to be higher than Bet Hillel and higher than Bet Shammai. And many Christians today want to uphold Bet Shammai after Erasmus, the great translator of the Bible and a contemporary of Luther. Now, with divorce, I want to emphasize, please, several points and how Jesus changed them regarding divorce and adultery. Number one, only the male could give a letter of divorce. A woman could not issue a divorce letter. Now, when Jesus came, he changed that. You know that he changed that? Matthew 24:1 shows that only the man gives the get. A letter of divorce. Only the man. And Jesus changed it. Read with me Mark chapter 10. What did Jesus say? Mark chapter 10. I'm going to share 7 points regarding divorce and adultery that Jesus changed in the New Covenant as the Rabbi of Galilee, as the sage. Mark chapter 10. I'll give you the text right now. Mark 10, verse 12. What does it say? Mark 10, verse 12. Read it, brother.
And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committed adultery.
Oh, Jesus was very progressive. That was never allowed in Judaism till our day. But Jesus says, if a woman shall put away her husband, a woman can give a letter of divorce. Mark chapter 10, what verse? 12. Second thing that Jesus changed. Number 2, the male could take on a concubine or any other and marry another woman or practice polygamy, and he would not be guilty of adultery. But a woman could not practice polygamy. So polygamy was allowed in the Old Covenant. You had the husband of Hannah, who had 2 wives, and he was a Levite, and it was allowed. But Jesus changed that. Jesus said, marriage, he gave a new definition of marriage. New definition of marriage. He said, back in the beginning it was not so. Matthew chapter 19, please. Matthew 19, verse 4. Verse 4. Who has that? Matthew 19, verse 4. You have it, Brother Watts?
Yeah,
What does it say?
it says that, and he answered, so it's questioning whether it's going to be Iliel or Shalat, and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female?
Now that's very important when you think from a Hebrew point of view. He says in the beginning. So now we had only the man gives the get, but Jesus says no, the woman can divorce. Okay to divorce. Number 2, we had a man could practice polygamy. Now Jesus changes that and says no more polygamy. It has to be one man for one wife. And he says the beginning. You know what he was saying?
Verse 6 and number 3.
He was saying beginning. Is beginning with double N? Beginning.
Yes.
Okay. The beginning. He was saying Berish. The Berish. Genesis. In the Genesis, it was not so. According to the Jews, the Torah is written in such a way that the older the writing, the more important it is. So every time the Jews come with a certain question, Jesus always takes them farther back to prove that they're wrong. When they cite Deuteronomy, he takes them to Genesis.
Wow.
He does this all the time. Because the closer you come to Eden, the closer you are to God. And they have that principle in everything they've written. The Mishnah is above the Talmud because it is closer. The Torah is above everything because it is closer. And Genesis, Berish, is back to the beginning. He takes them to the beginning. Now, in the world, the Greeks have a totally different mindset.
That's right.
When you go to university, you have a totally, that's too old. That's old stuff. We need to go with the new, only the new. And they're wrong. The Jewish concept is correct. And I'm going to prove it by citing Jeremiah. Jeremiah says, seek ye the old paths. The oldest path we have is Genesis. One man for one woman. One woman for one man. That's Genesis. That's the highest level we can attain in our understanding of Scripture. And we go to Jeremiah. Thank you, brother. 6:16. Jeremiah 6:16. Stand ye in the way and ask for the old paths. Look and ask for the old paths, for the good way, and walk therein, and you shall find rest. The old path, the beginning. Berish. Berish means Genesis. That's the Hebrew word for Genesis.
That's the first word
In the Bible.
in the Bible.
The first word in the Bible. And God is in the beginning. And John does that. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, number 3. If a couple was living in fornication, they had to marry and could not divorce. Jesus changed that. And now he says if two people are living together, they can separate or they can marry. They do not have to marry. That's another change he has. And I need to erase this. Another change Jesus brings about. And that's based on Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29 that we already read. That if a couple was living in fornication, they had to marry and could not divorce. Now Jesus says, no, you don't need to marry. If you have not gone to the Erusin, you can separate. Matthew chapter 19. Jesus says, Paul makes it even clearer. He says, flee from fornication. Verse 9. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whosoever marrieth her that which is put away doth commit adultery. We'll go deeper into that text. But here, Jesus is talking about a husband and a wife, and they have a right to separate because of fornication. A couple living together is fornication. They have a right to separate. Now, number 4. I didn't write number 3. Number 3, a man fornicating with a virgin was to marry her without divorcing her. But Jesus changed that, and he says you can separate. If you are living in fornication. And this has a lot of connotation to us today, because the Bible gives different definitions of fornication. If you're married to a homosexual, you have a right to separate. If you are, your spouse changes and becomes homosexual, that's happened to many people. Evil spirits come into them. If you are in an incestuous relationship, you have a right to separate. Incest. If you are a child bride, I believe you have a right to separate. They do this in Arabia. A 60-year-old, a 40-year-old marries a 9-year-old. That's totally wrong. That's child abuse. She has a right to separate. And Jesus is saying that is fornication. That is not correct.
What's the text?
The 4th.
What is the text?
Which one now?
The text.
The text. Matthew 19:9. A 4th reason. Once divorced, the divorced woman could marry another man. The man could always marry. Please understand that in Jewish culture. It was not a problem for him, it was a problem for her. God allowed it because otherwise they would kill their wives in that time. And if I have time, I'll cover the Roman marriage. But the 4th difference is that the divorced woman could marry another. But Jesus changes that. And Jesus says you cannot remarry. Jesus says no remarriage after divorce. And we have the text in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, if you, what is 32, 5:32, where Jesus says, if you divorce your wife, you cause her to commit adultery. If you divorce her. Matthew 5:32. That's another difference. Matthew 5:32. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, save for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. That is not in the Old Testament. If you marry a divorcee, you do not commit adultery. If a woman that is divorced remarries, she does not commit adultery. Now Jesus says you commit adultery if you're divorced and you remarry. And if you marry a divorcee, you also commit adultery. That's a whole new concept that Jesus presents.
So this is also Luke 16 and Mark.
Yes, also in Luke 16.
Verse 8.
They need to remain single. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 and 11. Or be reconciled. Jesus introduces the position of the need to reconcile. Number 5. Jesus gives a new definition of adultery. In the Old Testament, adultery was to sleep with a married woman. So if a man is married and he sleeps with a woman that is married, that is not his wife, that's adultery. If he sleeps with a virgin, that's not adultery. He could make her his concubine. Jesus gives a new definition of adultery. And I have proof for this. I have here the statements of Ecclesiasticus. This is an apocryphal book. Chapter 23, verses 22 and 23, to show the mindset of Judaism. It says, similarly, the woman who deserts her husband and provides him with an heir by another man, first, she has disobeyed the law of the Most High. Secondly, she has been false to her husband. And thirdly, she has gone whoring in adultery. Talks about a triple bond. And I won't have time to cover it now, but I'll cover that later, that marriage is a triple bond. And next time we're going to go right through Matthew 19 and explain it verse by verse, so that you're able to understand what Jesus is saying. So Jesus gave a new definition of adultery. New definition.
That's number 5.
Of adultery. He said adultery equals divorce and remarriage. We're going to read that in Mark chapter 10. It's very clear in Mark chapter 10, because what he said in Matthew chapter 19, the apostles did not understand. They really had a hard time. Mark chapter 10, verse 11. Let's read verse 10. 10, 11, and 12. 10, 11, and 12 of Mark. A new definition of adultery. And this is so important for us to understand. And I've been presenting all these other things about Judaism to see how Jesus was changing the whole mindset of divorce and adultery and remarriage according to the Hebrew mind. Changing it. Leaving the old covenant and going back to the beginning, to Genesis, to Berish. Mark chapter 10 says, verse 10, and in the house his disciples asked him again of the same matter. And he saith unto them, look, this is how it is. Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another commits adultery. You divorce and you remarry, that's adultery. And if a woman shall put away her husband and marry another, she commits adultery. So even though she can now divorce, but if she remarries, that's adultery. Divorce alone, under some cases, is not adultery. And we mentioned them in cases of incest, in cases of harlotry, in cases of homosexuality. It would not be wrong to divorce, where your life is at stake. Jesus says if they persecute you in one city, go to another. I need to end here. We have 2 more to cover. That adultery is no longer a sentence of death. That was number 6. That was a big change. In the Old Covenant, if you committed adultery, you were killed. Jesus says, no, we don't kill in the New Testament. You can commit adultery, you can commit fornication, you will not be killed. That's a whole change. John chapter 8, verses 4 through 5 and 7. And the 7th change that Jesus brought is that according to the Jews, you only commit adultery on the outside. Jesus says, no, with your mind you can commit adultery. That's new. And I finish with this story of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter writes that he had committed adultery in his mind. And a rabbi wrote to him and said, no, you can only commit adultery if you sleep with a woman. What you do with your mind has no effect. And this was the Pharisees, that's, the Pharisees' point of view, and Jesus wanted to change that. Thank you for your attention. We'll, next time we'll cover the triple bond. We'll talk about the new principle of reconciliation. You need to reconcile in love that Jesus presents and Paul does too. Rashi says adultery is only with a married woman. That's what Rashi says, the greatest commentator of all times in Judaism. He says that in his Pentateuch, volume 2, page 218. We don't believe that. We believe the new position of Jesus, a higher standard. Thank you. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back to hear at 12:30 with Brother Buddy Clark.